Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
My name is Kim Ricketts, and I manage the Microsoft Research Visiting Speaker Series along with Kirsten Wiley. Today we welcome Walter Isaacson here to Microsoft Research. He's an accomplished man himself, aside from Einstein. He is currently president and CEO of the Aspen Institute and has been chairman and CEO of CNN and the managing editor of Time magazine. He is the author of other biographies of important men, one on Benjamin Franklin and one on Henry Kissinger. He graduated from Harvard and was a Rhodes Scholar at Pembroke College, Oxford University. Today, however, he's here to discuss the life and the legacy of Albert Einstein, a man we feel we all know, an icon of his century of scientific endeavor. In fact, Time magazine's man of the century. But do we really know the man and the scientist that is Albert Einstein? Just last year in 2006, a huge quantity of his personal and professional papers were unsealed for the first time. So with that information, do we now know anything new about Einstein? Well, in his new biography, Walter Isaacson uses new sources and confronts old myths about Einstein. No, he didn't flunk math as a child, and no, his physical brain was not so different from other men. Einstein was a man firmly rooted in the struggles and the triumphs of his time, in the anti-Semitism of the time, but also in the exciting technological innovations, in the enthusiasm for science saving the human race and the dread of science ending the human race. We would all love to believe that this extraordinary brain set him apart from others. But as Walter Isaacson writes in his new biography, his successes come not from the brute strength of his mental processing power, but from his imagination and creativity. Please join me in welcoming Walter Isaacson to Microsoft Research.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you all very much. It's really great to be back here and back in this building where I've been so many times. And it's especially good to do this talk, which I'm going to do on creativity, at Microsoft. I don't know if you all know this, but before some of you were born, I used to be here a bit and once did a cover story on Bill Gates for Time magazine really early on in the company. And it dealt with his feel for creativity and imagination. And he told me that one of his favorite quotes was Einstein's imagination is more important than knowledge. And we even went over how Microsoft chooses people. And it's not, as you know, through just mental processing power or credentialism, but by looking for the sparks of creativity that make somebody special. So in this lecture, I just wanted to give a little sense of how Einstein was particularly imaginative, partly rebellious, and thought so differently and out of the box that it made him different from, say, Max Planck, Lorentz, Poincaré, and the other scientists of the time, who probably had as much mental processing power and certainly more knowledge, but didn't have the imagination to see what Einstein saw. The good news about Einstein, for those of us who are parents now, is that he was no Einstein when he was a kid. He was very slow in learning how to talk, very slow verbally. So slow that his parents consulted a doctor, and the family maid said that he called him the dopey one in the family. And secondly, he was incredibly rebellious. He gets kicked out of school by one headmaster. Another teacher amuses history by saying he'll never amount to much. Einstein always said the defiance of authority was the key to his imagination. This, of course, makes him the patron saint of distracted school kids everywhere. He's sort of the poster child for people who talk late and people who are creative. But I also think that it was this set of traits, slow verbal learning ability, even slowness in just learning regular, normal, mundane things, as well as the rebelliousness that was a key to his genius. One of the things he said about it was, you know, here's a guy whose big first conceptual leap is about time and space, why they're not absolute. And he says, it's because I was so slow in learning how to develop that other people had thought about time and space before. You know, they'd quit wondering about time and space. But as I grew up, I still wondered, why did time keep passing? And was Newton right that it kind of passed irrespective of our observing of it? And, you know, most of us, you and I, probably at age 7, 8, 9, are not sitting there still worrying about, what makes time actually tick forward and stuff. But Einstein was. In fact, his dad gave him a compass when he was 5. And he said, Einstein said he would stay up at night sort of trembling at the excitement of watching the needle point north and wondering at the unseen force fields in the universe and saying that there had to be something, forces that we couldn't see behind everything, and this kept him up. Now, you and I probably remember getting a compass when we were kids, but, we'd say, wow, cool, it points north, and then we're on to something else a minute later. But he's always trying to figure out the notion of a field, the forces in the universe. And also, as I say, always rebellious. These are quotes about his childhood, that suspicious of every kind of authority, an attitude which has never left me. A foolish faith in authority is the worst enemy of truth. Now, as Kim said, it's deeply, deeply unfortunate for those of us who write biographies of Einstein that the tale about him flunking math as a child happens to be untrue. If you Google, or MSN search, I should say, I don't know how it works out there, but there's 66,000 websites if you use the phrase Einstein failed math. And they all say things like, as everybody knows, Einstein failed math as a kid, so there's hope for me. Well, he didn't fail math. In fact, he was good at math. He had some problems, as you can see on his report card, and other things, such as languages, but he was pretty cool in math. And the reason he was cool in math gets back to the thing I was talking about. He visualizes things. In fact, he does the Pythagorean theorem when he's a kid, not by sort of just the rote memorization that sort of got him upset when he was a student, but he just looks at two right triangles of different sizes, compares the different sizes of the triangle, looks at the proportions of them, and says he can visualize why the Pythagorean theorem is true. I was helping my daughter with her homework a little while ago. She's 16. She was doing algebra, and she got an equation wrong on her homework. She had multiplied it, and I said, and it reminds me of Gates, actually, because he told me about this, how he could look at math equations and visualize them and just see what was behind them. So I said to my daughter, no, just look at that equation. It's got to slope upward like this. You've got it wrong. She says, what do you mean? I said, well, an equation is just a good Lord's brushstroke for painting something in reality. And just like when she does Latin. So I said, just like when you translate the Odyssey and you see the phrase rosy-fingered dawn, what do? You picture a rosy-fingered dawn. Well, you should visualize whatever it is the equation tells you. She says, oh, they don't teach us that in school. I said, well, it's one of the things that I wish we did teach more in school, is that math is a visual, creative, imaginative endeavor and stuff. Einstein, at age 16, being slightly smarter than my daughter, at least in math, is looking at Maxwell's equations. And you all know Maxwell's equations, but they were new back then in the late 1800s. And Einstein tries to visualize how they work. Now, Maxwell's equations say that electromagnetic waves, or a light wave, always travel at a constant speed, 186,000 miles per second or so. And no matter what frame of reference you look at it, there would be 186 at a constant speed of light. And Einstein visualizes these sets of equations and says, what would it be like, this is a 16-year-old kid, to ride alongside a light wave? What happens if you catch up with it? Wouldn't the wave be stationary next to you? And he said it didn't work, because if you caught up with the wave, Maxwell's equations say it'll still be going constant speed of light. He said, I walked around in a state of high anxiety for weeks on end, worried about this paradox, causing my palms to sweat. And I was thinking of all the things that was causing my palms to sweat at age 16, and they weren't Maxwell's equations. But that's why he's Einstein, and we're not. He runs away, like my old friend Dr. Benjamin Franklin, runs away from the rigid learning. Franklin runs away from the rigid learning of Puritan Massachusetts Bay Colony. Einstein runs away from the rigid rote learning of the gymnasium in Germany. He goes to Italy as a little runaway and tries to get in, eventually in Switzerland, to the second best college in Zurich, the Zurich Polytechnic. And he fails. He fails his admissions test. I've always wanted, was never able to find out who was the admissions officer who denied entry to Albert Einstein into the Zurich Polytechnic. But the next year, fortunately, he does get into the Zurich Polytechnic, does moderately well, but he's able to piss off all three of his major professors because of his defiance of authority. There's Heinrich Weber, the physics professor, doesn't even teach Maxwell's equations, considers them too newfangled and stuff. So when Einstein describes the paradox of catching up with the wave of light and what it seems stationary, there's Weber saying, no, he just doesn't get it. So Einstein starts calling him Herr Weber instead of Herr Professor, considered a great insult, and so Weber doesn't really speak to him again. Minkowski's the math professor. Einstein, at this stage of his life, did not know that math could help him discover theories. He thought it was just a cleanup act after you discovered the theories. So he didn't attend math class at Minkowski, and instead had a ne'er-do-well friend of his best friend at the time, Marcel Grossman, take notes for him in Minkowski's class. And then there's Pernay, the lab instructor, the experimentalist. I don't have a picture of him because, you know, I guess he didn't go down in history enough to be pictured. But at one point, Einstein is given an instruction sheet about how to do an experiment. Einstein was not a great experimentalist, which is, of course, why he had to become a theorist. But he throws away the paper, wants to do it his own way, and blows up the lab equipment, so Pernay puts him on academic probation. Thus it is that Einstein's the only graduate in 1900 of the Zurich Polytechnic classes in physics and math who can't get a job. Can't get a job as a teaching assistant, assistant professor, doctoral fellow, no fellowships, no nothing. All three of his professors keep giving him bad recommendations, so much so that he applies to 16 different high schools around Europe and can't get a job teaching high school physics and math, all because of bad recommendations, a rebellious spirit, that sort of thing. It takes 2 years as he's wandering around, putting ads in the Zurich newspaper saying, tutorials by Albert Einstein, trial lesson free, and he gets one student who becomes his close friend, and he quits charging them, and they just discuss Hume and Mach and philosophy instead of doing lessons. So he's totally unemployed. And finally, Marcel Grossman, the guy who took notes from him in math class, still one of his close friends, gets him a job as a patent clerk. Through family connections, he's able to get Einstein a job as a third-class examiner in the Bern office of the Swiss Patent Office. Third-class examiner because Einstein didn't have a doctorate. You needed a doctorate to be a second or first-class examiner. He didn't have a doctorate because his dissertation has been rejected twice by Weber and the people back in Zurich. But lest we feel sorry for Einstein, I think it's really cool that he's working at the patent office. It's almost like, I mean, you could probably feel it today working in this building, the research building of Microsoft, because what he's doing is he's looking at applications for devices for new ideas, new thoughts. I once sat in on a few pitch meetings with Greg and Gates and others where they say, okay, we're going to try this. And there's Einstein told by his boss to question every premise, just challenge every premise that anybody does on an application, and to visualize the underlying theory behind these practical devices and stuff. Plus, he's there working right outside the clock tower there, the Bern clock tower, the famous 11th century clock tower. Trains running beneath the clock tower into the station with all the clocks along the station. And most of the devices he's looking at for patents, since he's in charge of electrical patents along with his other best friend, Michele Besso, are for the synchronization of clocks, because Switzerland had just gone on standard time zones at that point, and the Swiss, being Swiss, are rather obsessive, and they really, really care about synchronizing the clock, so that when it strikes 7 in Zurich, it's going to strike 7 at the exact moment in Bern. So all these devices have one thing in common: you got to send a signal between the clocks in distant places, and the signals travel at the speed of light, whether they're radio signals, light signals, electrical signals. So there you got a patent clerk watching the trains dash by right outside of the Postal and Telegraph building, looking at patent applications, the synchronizing of clocks, and still wondering, as he had since age 16, what happens when you ride alongside a light beam. How does it work? How do the equations work? So we get to his miracle year, 1905, in which, hanging around with Michele Besso and Conrad Habich and all of his other friends, He's there in the Berne patent office thinking about these things. And fortunately, the guy on the far left of that picture, Conrad, goes away in early May for a few weeks to try to write a dissertation, doesn't write Einstein. So Einstein writes him a typical Einstein impertinent, nasty letter. Begins, you frozen whale, you can-smoked piece of soul, you haven't sent me your dissertation, and so I'm going to just write you a letter filled with inconsequential babble until you send me your paper. But if you do, I will send you 4 papers I've been working on in my spare time in return. It's only in the second paragraph of the letter that you realize that this contains the most interesting historic tidings in the history of science in one letter ever written. He says, the first paper deals with the energy properties of light and is very revolutionary. Well, yep, that's the one that basically says light is not just a wave, it's a particle. It's the basis of all of quantum theory done in the spare time by a third-class patent examiner. And once again, it is a leap of creative imagination that doesn't come from being the most knowledgeable, the smartest dude on the block. Max Planck, who was more knowledgeable in physics at the time and probably had as much mental processing power, Max Planck had already come up with the mathematical notion of Planck's constant that he had to use in his equations to get black-body radiation, the equations to work. But Max Planck doesn't visualize things. He doesn't know it. He doesn't know what is this little tiny Planck's constant. Einstein, the patent clerk, gets to visualize it and says, I get it. It says light is a particle. That light is actually a particle, a unit. And it's not just some mathematical contrivance. He says the second paper deals with the true size of atoms. Now, back then, most professors weren't even sure atoms existed. It was sort of a new theory. Yet Einstein uses it as his latest attempt to get a doctoral dissertation accepted because he knows it's the easiest of the 4 papers he has written. He says the third deals with Brownian motion, which, as you know, is why particles jiggle in water. And he says the fourth is only a rough draft at this point, but it involves the modification of the theory of space and time. So you go, wow, that's not inconsequential babble. That's pretty cool. And, of course, it's a special theory of relativity. But he doesn't tell Conrad, because he hadn't thought of it while he was writing this letter. He only thinks of it 2 weeks later after he finishes the draft of the 4th paper, is that as soon as he finishes that draft, a new thought will pop into his head, which is if that paper on special relativity is right and particle nature of light, etc., that there's a relationship between energy and mass that involves the speed of light. And thus, you get to the most famous equation in all of physics, E equals mc squared. And anyway, as you know, relativity is a very simple concept. Even Galileo got it right in the Discourse on Two-World Systems, that no matter what your state of constant velocity motion, there's nobody who can say I'm at absolute rest and you're in motion. All motion is just relative. All the laws of physics apply, whether you're in Galileo's hold of the ship in the Discourse of Two-World Systems with the windows blocked out and you're sailing smoothly, whether butterflies are flying around or you're talking or bouncing a ball or dropping a pebble in water. Everything happens just the same as if you were on the shore. In fact, you know, nobody can say, I'm at rest and you're moving. You know, you may think we're sitting here at rest. If we looked out of the window and saw a plane, we'd say it's moving. But we're moving at about, I don't know, 36,000 miles per hour around the sun as we orbit around. And the sun is moving even much faster than that around the galaxy, and heavens knows what the galaxy is doing. But, you know, everything's in motion. All we know is relative motion. But that seems to conflict with Maxwell's equations. Does it really hold for electromagnetism? Why can't you catch up, as a 16-year-old Einstein wondered, with the light wave so that Maxwell's equations are different depending on your state of motion? And that's what's causing him the great conflict when he's a 16-year-old, and now 10 years later as a patent clerk, it's still bothering him. And he's looking at all those applications about synchronizing clocks. He tells Michele Besso, the other guy doing the applications on synchronizing clocks, I still don't get it. I'm giving up on it. This is right before he writes the letter to Habak. But then they take a walk one day. He's looking at a clock tower in a distant town, and it's an amazing moment. He says, I've got it. I've got it. And he calls it the step. And he explains it the next morning when he gets into work to Besso, who's been baffled for the rest of the afternoon. But that morning he says, I've got it. I'll explain it to you. And it involves simultaneity. What do we mean by two things being simultaneous? Now, once again, you got a guy like Einstein who is marveling not at the mysterious stuff, but at the mundane, the ordinary. you and I don't sit there and wonder, what does it mean to be simultaneous? You think, hey, it means it happens at the same time. Einstein says, yeah, but what? Way over there, something happens. Way over there, something. How do we know it happens at the same time? He's a patent examiner. He needs an operational definition. He doesn't trust, absolutes and stuff. So he says, one way to describe something happening at the same time is if you're standing halfway between the two events and the light from the two events hits you and you see it at the same time. That means they happened at the same time. They're simultaneous. But then he says, he does what he's called the step. And you got to remember, he's sitting there looking at the trains, rushing into the station and stuff. He says, what if there's a fast-moving train? And lightning strikes both ends of the fast-moving train. Suppose a guy is standing on the platform, halfway between the two lightning strikes. And the light from both strikes hits him at the exact same time. What does the guy say? Those strikes were simultaneous. Suppose that right as the lightning strikes, there's a woman on the train, halfway on the train. But the train is dashing forward. Remember, it's a thought experiment. And in the nanosecond, fraction of a nanosecond, it takes the light to get from both lightning strikes to move, because it can only travel at the speed of light. She is a tiny fraction further towards the front. So she says, no, the lightning strike in front happened first. Now, according to the principle of relativity, neither one of them is right, and neither one of them is wrong. What's simultaneous is relative, depending on your state of motion. From that, Einstein, in very simple language, talking about looking at the light from your watch and striking when the watch hits 7 and the trains get to the station, he says, it being simultaneous is relative depending on your state of motion. Time is relative depending on your state of motion. And it answers this question about chasing a light beam, which is, if you're trying to travel alongside a light wave and you travel close to the speed of light and you think you're going to catch up with it, Maxwell's equations still apply. The waves still travel at the constant speed of light, but time slows down for you as you approach the speed of light. Now, even you at Microsoft probably scratch your heads a bit and say, how does that work and stuff? And if it makes you, feel better, it seems both simple and yet a little weird. And this third-class patent examiner, he publishes these papers. Next year, he still can't get a job in the academy. Still trying. Still can't get a job teaching high school. Still sending off more applications. Basically, the physicist community of Europe is a bit baffled, doesn't know what this is, whether it's philosophy or real science. Even though Lorentz is coming up with contractions to explain the very same thing, and Michelson and Morley are getting all things all confused with the ether, this is the answer. But it still takes them 4 years to get a job in a university. Helping them with those papers is a really interesting woman named Eleva Maritz, who, young girl, physics and math student in Serbia, when it was hard to be a woman in physics and math. Her father's an army officer, so forces the Zagreb Academy to teach her physics and math, even though they don't take women. And she moves on and finally becomes the only girl or woman in the class at the Zurich Polytechnic with Albert Einstein. And as you might suspect, by the fact that they're here together, they fall madly in love. It's a tumultuous relationship. We just get the letters yet last year, some of the more sensational letters about burning pillows and my dolly, about her taking a hike around Lake Como when they're just students with blankets in the melting snow, and she gets pregnant. They have an illegitimate daughter named Lazurl that is a mystery in history, but I try to work on it in the book a bit. They can't get married because he doesn't have a job, but eventually, when he does get the job in the patent office, they get married. They have 2 sons, Edward and Hans Albert, and their relationship begins to deteriorate really badly over the next 5 or 10 years. Vicious letters back and forth, the kids being used as pawns. He all of a sudden realized that Albert Einstein is a flesh and blood human being, can be very mean at times, but also deeply working in his stuff. World War I is looming, all these things happening, and this marriage is breaking up. And finally, in order to get a divorce when he doesn't have enough money, he offers her a deal. He says, one of these days, one of those papers will win the Nobel Prize, and when it does, if you give me a divorce, I will give you the money. Now, she's a scientist. She takes a while to think about it. She consults with Fritz Haber, gets herself a lawyer, spends a week, draws up a contract, takes the bet. It's not until 1922 that they finally catch up with what Einstein has done, and his Nobel Prize is announced, and she gets the money and buys 3 apartment buildings in Zurich. In the meantime, Einstein is trying, amidst the war, his pacifism, he's once again defying authority. He's a professor at the University of Berlin by 1915, 1914, as war is breaking out. He's the only professor at the University of Berlin not to sign the manifesto supporting Germany in the war. He writes a pacifist memo, defiance of authority still being his hallmark. Besides the horrible visits from the kids back and forth and buying skis and all sorts of things when you want to read about the personal, you can in the book, because this is happening. He's trying to do the most beautiful and elegant theory in the history of science, which is the general theory of relativity. And in 1915, it's all coming down on him. And the general theory, it's called the general theory, of course. I'm sure in this room most of you, all of you know this, but because the special theory deals only with the special case of constant velocity motion. General theory deals with accelerated motion, because if you're in an accelerated frame of reference, you think it's different. I mean, it's not like all motion is the same as it is with constant velocity. If you're in accelerated, you feel it. The coffee sloshes, the balls bounce differently. And, you know, it feels like you're in an absolute form of motion. He doesn't like special cases. He likes everything to be generalized. He likes unity. So he wants to generalize it. And he also has overthrown Sir Isaac Newton's 2 great pillars of absolute time and absolute space. But there's still Isaac Newton's theory of gravity, which says big objects, any objects, at a distance, attract each other mysteriously, at a distance, instantly. Einstein doesn't feel right to him, even though this is the way he wants to totally revise the entire concept of the universe to say that gravity is not a mysterious attraction at a distance, because nothing can happen instantly at a distance. Nothing, not even information, can travel faster than the speed of light, according to his theory. So he's got to overthrow Newton's theory of gravity. Once again, it's a creative leap that others should have figured out. It is not heavy mental processing power dealing with experiments and stuff. He just says his thought experiment is imagine yourself in a closed chamber, such as an elevator. And if the elevator chamber on the left there is sitting on the Earth's surface, it's in a gravitational field, what do you feel? You feel your feet being pressed to the floor. You take something in your pocket and you drop it, it falls to the floor at an accelerated rate. Now imagine that the chamber on the right is not on Earth, but in deep outer space with no gravitational field. But it's accelerating upward. What do you feel? You feel your feet being pressed to the floor just the same way. You take something out of your pocket, it falls to the floor at an accelerated rate, just the same way. He calls it the principle of equivalence. All of the effects of being in the gravitational field are equivalent to all of the effects of being in an accelerated field. And from that, he gets the principle of equivalence, which everybody else, once again, including Galileo, should have figured out, because everybody knows, even those of us who've taken high school physics, that inertial mass is equal to gravitational mass all the time. That's why Galileo's dropping balls from the Leaning Tower and all that sort of thing. They're trying to prove that and figure it out, but nobody knows why. Inertial mass is the force it takes to accelerate something. Gravitational mass is the weight it has in the gravitational field. Why are they always equivalent? It takes Einstein to do a simple thought experiment and say, because gravity and acceleration are equivalent. And from that, he comes up with a whole new way of looking at the universe. This is not some incremental evolution of science. This is a leap of true imagination, that gravity is not the attraction of 2 forces, but it's the curving of the fabric of space. A whole different way of looking at the universe. Once again, he gives us a thought picture. He says, imagine a ball, a bowling ball, let us say, on a 2-dimensional fabric, and you roll it on the fabric. Picture it as a trampoline fabric, if you want. The 2-dimensional fabric of the trampoline. As the bowling ball goes on it, what happens? It curves the fabric. It's a dip. Now imagine you roll some billiard balls behind it. What happens to the billiard balls? They roll, and then they start curving to the bowling ball until they get to it and stuff. Why? Not because the bowling ball has exerted some mysterious attraction, but because it's curved the fabric, and they roll down to the bowling ball. Now, it's easy for us to imagine that on a 2-dimensional basis, 2-dimensional fabric. And for people here who work at Microsoft, no doubt you can imagine in 3 dimensions, the curving of all 3 dimensions in space. And if you were in Einstein, you'd actually be able to imagine it curving all 4 dimensions of what Einstein calls space-time, because space and time are all related to Einstein into one fabric. So he says gravity is a warping of space-time. This, once again, causes most of the physicists in Europe in 1915. Remember, as I said, he doesn't win a Nobel Prize until 1922, and not even for relativity. Never wins one. It causes them to scratch their heads a bit. In fact, with anti-Semitism rising, it causes them to label it Jewish science because it's not concrete, doesn't bear reality, like string theory maybe or something. It doesn't have any connection to the real world. And Adolf Hitler, a young politician in Munich, talks about Deutsch physics versus Einstein's Jewish physics. They want to quit teaching it. So Einstein comes up with a way to try to connect it to reality to show it. It says if all of this is right, then gravity will bend a light beam. If you take all of the series together, gravity bends a light beam. E equals mc squared, all the sort of stuff. And he says, he does the calculations because it's not just it'll bend it, but it'll bend it by a certain amount. He says a light beam passing right next to the sun will be bent by 1.7 arc seconds. He says if you look at a star, as the light from that star comes right next to the sun with its gravitational field, it'll shift 1.7 arc seconds. There's a problem with doing that because the sun gets in your eyes. But you can do it during a total eclipse of the sun. And right as World War I is ending, Sir Arthur Eddington, a Quaker English pacifist, decides to prove the theory of a German Jewish pacifist to show how science triumphs over politics. And he sends a famous expedition out to Principe off the coast of Africa, to Brazil, to photograph the total eclipse of the sun in 1919 and to see if the stars are where they're supposed to be or whether they've been shifted by 1.7 arc seconds. It takes 4 months to bring all the plates back to London from the 2 different continents, have them developed, have them compared. Then they convene a meeting of the Royal Academy in the Grand Hall in Piccadilly. Sir Arthur Eddington in the chair along with J.J. Thomson. They turn to the portrait above them of the founder and first president of the Royal Academy, and they say, "Forgive us, Sir Isaac Newton, your universe has been overturned." That was back in the days when the New York Times knew how to write really great headlines and people knew how to cover science. And there it is. Lights all askew in the heavens. This is a big story in the New York Times reporting on this. Men of science more or less agog over a result of eclipse observations. Einstein theory triumphs. Stars not where they seemed or were calculated to be, but nobody need worry. Anyway, he becomes an absolute super celebrity, probably the most famous person on Earth at that point, with his wild halo of hair and everything else. People are puzzling all over about, the theory of relativity. It becomes sort of one of the great things. And Einstein does something unusual. He comes to America not just as a visiting scientist, but because he's been connected to his Jewish heritage by all the anti-Semitism. So he comes with Chaim Weizmann to raise money for exiled Jewish scholars, for Hebrew University, for all the things there. And comes to America where he's treated, you've never seen anything like this, like a unbelievable celebrity. Rock stars would envy this treatment. Parades, 15,000 people meet the boat at the bottom of lower Manhattan at the Battery when Weizmann and Einstein arrive. Weizmann comes off the boat first, and they ask him the question they ask everybody who's been with Einstein, which is, do you understand the theory of relativity? Weizmann says, on the way over, Professor Einstein explained it to me many, many times each evening, and by the time we got here, I was convinced he understood it. I know that you all like scientists, but imagine the days when there'd be parades up and down Cincinnati, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Princeton, Boston, New York, all the way up, of Einstein being paraded the way he is as a great celebrity scientist. He's taken to Washington, and only those of us who live in Washington can fathom this, which is that when he gets to Washington, the Senate of the United States decides to debate whether relativity theory is correct or not. With John Rankin, Senator John Rankin of Mississippi in the opposition and Boyce Penrose of Missouri in favor of it. They bring him to see the president, President Harding. They ask Harding the obvious question, which is, do you understand relativity? Harding, being an honest politician back then, says no. And Einstein lets on it's okay because Einstein doesn't understand the theory of normalcy, which was Harding's political platform and stuff. Opening of City Lights with the only person who rivaled him, perhaps as the most famous person in the world at that point, Charlie Chaplin. Chaplin says to him, they cheer you because they don't understand you, and they cheer me because they understand me. Anyway, Einstein goes on. I don't want to extend this lecture, so that's sort of the culmination of his life. After that, his quantum theory, as you know, becomes a form of a new view of mechanics, or quantum mechanics, that involves, with Niels Bohr and the Copenhagen School, probabilities at its core. And this is something that is perhaps relevant in this room and stuff, because with Heisenberg and the uncertainty principle, Einstein, who has been the rebel his whole life, been the one willing to throw everything out, been always creative, the young Turk, all of a sudden becomes more defensive of the old order, starts resisting quantum mechanics, starts resisting the new ideas. And it happens to some of us when we turn 50, is that even if we thought of ourselves as being very rebellious, suddenly we're somewhat defensive of the old order. And it happens to Einstein. Famously, he keeps saying at the Solvay conferences and elsewhere when he's doing his thought experiments, trying to disprove Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, other things, he says, I cannot believe that God would play dice with the universe. He wants to retain strict causality, the last pillar of Isaac Newton's universe, which is strict causality, when he had really been willing to knock out the other three pillars and stuff. At one point, Niels Bohr says to him, Einstein, please quit telling God what to do. Having been a pacifist, he also changes his views when Hitler comes to power, and with Leo Szilard and others, as they conceive of a nuclear chain reaction, the implementation of E equals mc squared, write the famous letter to Franklin Roosevelt, sort of explaining how you could build a bomb. And it starts the Manhattan Project. Some irony in history, Einstein, because he was a pacifist, J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI collected a dossier on him. He was not given a security clearance, couldn't work on the project. But still, he's associated in the public mind with the atom bomb. We kind of see the E equals mc squared on the mushroom cloud when we picture it and stuff. So he becomes very fervent in the pursuit of arms control and world peace. And once again, this point of why are you resisting the new advances, quantum mechanics? He'd always been impudent, a guardian angel in the world, but now he says, he realizes he's a conservative defending the old order. He says, to punish me for my contempt for authority, fate made me an authority myself. But still, for the last 20 years of his life, he's dedicated himself to world peace, for Israel, and for overcoming, or the incompleteness, as he sees it, of quantum mechanics, trying to come up with the unified field theory, like a general theory, trying to unify everything, the forces of electromagnetism, gravity, and quantum mechanics and stuff. And even to his death, he's on his deathbed. Ben Gurion has asked him to give a speech to Israel, and his Einstein hemorrhaging because his aneurysm burst. They bring him to Princeton Hospital, and he knows he refuses an operation, so he knows it's time for him to go. But he reaches onto his bedside table and writes the first sentence of the speech that he knows he'll never be able to deliver, because he wants to take the speech for Israel Independence Day and bring it to a higher level to talk about the need for world peace in the nuclear age. So his first sentence is, I speak to you today not only as a Jew and not only as an American citizen, but as a human being. Then the pain becomes too great and he puts it aside, but he, about an hour later, revives a small bit and reaches again for his bedside table, but instead of continuing with the speech, he starts working again on something he's been working on for 20 years in a futile effort, that unified field theory, just scribbling more and more lines of equations, crossing out the math, trying to get, even though he knows he'll never finish it, just one step closer to the spirit manifest in the laws of the universe. That's the last page he writes, still crossing out the math, till finally the last set of equations dribble off near the end of the page. So that's how a very impertinent, rebellious, but unbelievably creative and imaginative third-class patent clerk became the mind reader of the creator of the cosmos. Thank you all very much. So I'm happy to sign books, or I assume you all have whatever programs to write or questions, one or the other. I'll either let you go back to your programming, or I'll answer one or two questions and then answer the rest informally as I sign books. Yes, sir, in the back.
What happened to his children?
What happened to his children? Edward, the younger son, like his mother, which is a little bit more tragic than I ended with her buying 3 apartment buildings in Zurich. She's somewhat mentally, I don't know, depressed and disturbed. She ends up getting treatment. Edward is a schizophrenic and descends slowly into total schizophrenia and is institutionalized in Zurich. I started the slideshow with him on the bicycle. I don't know if you saw that quote where he says, "Life is like riding a bicycle. In order to keep your balance, you must keep moving." Written as a letter to Edward in 1930 when he's being institutionalized in Zurich. Is his father saying, you know, keep moving so you'll keep your balance. In 1933, Hitler's taken power. Einstein's in Europe and is about to go back to Princeton. He knows he's going to see Edward for the very last time he goes to the mental institution. They can't really talk to each other almost. So Einstein, who loves the violin, pulls out the violin and they play Mozart together. And he ends up dying in the mental institution. Hans Albert, on the other hand, immigrates to America, reconciles with his father. I mean, they'd had a tough relationship, especially in the 1915 period, but by this point they're really close. When Einstein immigrates to America, he helps Hans Albert and his wife and sons come over, and he comes over and becomes a professor of hydraulics engineering at Berkeley. No longer alive, nor his sons, but he has grandchildren who live in California.
Child as well.
Mileva, Lazurel, what happens to the illegitimate daughter? I explored in the book. There are sleuths throughout history who've tried to find Einstein's daughter. Every now and then, like Anastasia, the Countess, she resurfaces, but I don't think really. My own view, and you'll have to read the book to see whether you agree, because I give the various series. She's put up for adoption in Serbia. I think she contracts scarlet. We know she contracts scarlet fever. And I think she dies of scarlet fever at age 3. But that's a little bit less exciting than other people's series. But unfortunately, for the goodness of the tale, it would be nicer if she resurfaces suddenly. But I have some pretty good evidence that we know she has scarlet fever, and the number of people who die in that epidemic in Novi Sad in Serbia with scarlet fever. Yes, ma'am. That's right.
There are many biographies of Einstein.
Yeah.
What did you hope to accomplish in doing this?
Many biographies of Einstein. They're particularly good biographies. Albrecht Folsing years ago wrote one in German that's been translated. There aren't as many soup to nuts biographies as you might think. Folsing is probably the only one you'd be able to find if you went to a store. And it's about 20 years old, and it doesn't have the papers, the private papers that were released over the past 15 years, but also this past last year, the final batch of secret sealed papers. But it's a good biography translated from the German. Ronald W. Clark did one in the 70s, which is good as well, but has none of the correspondence. And I'm not trying to knock them. I think they're both very good books. What's particularly good are the scientific works about Einstein. Abraham Pye's Settling the Lord is an awesome book. And if you either like my book or, for that matter, don't like my book, you should get Pye's, because it does far deeper the scientific and mathematical subtleties of his work. So I think that's the best biography out there, especially as a scientific biography. Jeremy Bernstein has written quite a few books, one on the 1905 papers called Secrets of the Old One, and a couple others, but hasn't done a soup to nuts biography, or birth to death biography. What I hope to accomplish was, first of all, weave together the personal and the political, which is where I focus a lot, as well as the scientific and the professional, using all of the personal papers, which have not been available to previous biographers, and weave it together in a narrative life. I'm a simple biographer. I do narrative. I tend to, despite what Einstein says, believe that time marches along and you should do things in order. He said time was just an illusion that physicists have to make sure everything doesn't happen all at once, but it's something we biographers use to make sure that you don't try to tell everything all at once. And so mine is like the Benjamin Franklin book, and so in 1915, for example, and I'm not, as I say, you really should read Pye's and the other books. They're actually better in many respects. But in the, take 1915, all these things are coming together. His pacifism, his outsider rebellion against the German militarism, his fights with Mileva, his unconventional way of dealing with everything personal, as well as him trying to generalize the theory of relativity while the war is going on and Elsa, his cousin, is nursing him to health. You know, I try to show it happening chronologically and bring the personal and the professional together. But if I'm lucky and people get interested in Einstein, hopefully they'll read some of the other great books, especially the scientific works.
Yes, so did he train some good students to follow up his work?
Did he train good students to follow his work? No, not as much as others did. Niels Bohr becomes the head of the Copenhagen School, you know, the Copenhagen interpretation. He's got more acolytes than you could find, you know, even at Microsoft, people having acolytes. I mean, you know, Heisenberg, all these people are, and so that he has a school, for that matter, you know, in England, Rutherford has great acolytes and stuff. Einstein tends to be a loner. He said a scientist should be a lighthouse keeper. You'd be all alone in a lighthouse just thinking in your head. I don't think you can do that in science these days. He may have been the last great He barely has collaborators. There's a great part of the book where I deal with whether or not Mileva was a collaborator, because that's one of history's arguments. But only in one case, the EPR experiments in the 1930s, does he truly collaborate. And then even that's not a collaboration. He only has one graduate student who ever studies under him, and he kind of basically abandons the guy. So he's not what you would call the world's best teacher. Last question, please.
Well, how would you characterize his love life after his divorce?
You know, the mysteries of attraction, be it gravitational or magnetic, are nothing compared to the personal mysteries of the force fields of attraction. And he has more women, and you know, I mean, I don't wallow in this, but it's hard because it's, I mean, he's not particularly embarrassed about it. Even after he marries Elsa, he has various girlfriends and stuff. Being German girlfriends or even American, anybody who was a girlfriend of Einstein didn't keep it quiet. They wrote diaries about it, letters about it. You know, you can. So it's in the book. Although I'm not one of those biographers who loves to wallow and say how sordid, because it wasn't particularly sordid. I mean, most of the time he's not married. After Elsa dies, the only lover he has of interest is, I mean, he has many lovers I mentioned, but the only one I dwell on is Martorina Kanakonova, who is a Soviet spy, but Einstein doesn't know it. And so even though the FBI had a dossier, as I said, which ends up being about 1,500 boxes of papers, they missed the fact that he was having an affair with a Soviet spy.
So if I recall reading on religion, Einstein had a view of Spinoza as kind of his model. Did that conflict with the Jewish view or how others?
Yeah. Very good question. I have a whole chapter called Einstein's God, because it is totally beautiful how deep. When he says, I cannot believe God would play dice with the universe, everybody thinks it's a figure of speech. He keeps saying, no, 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 I believe in God. I believe in a deist sort of concept of God, not a personal God who intervenes in our lives. And I go over and over all the dinners where he's arguing about his belief in God. At one point, and I'll do it at great length in the book, but, you know, he says, I believe in, there's a spirit manifest in the laws of the universe, a spirit in the face of which we must be humbled and awed. Our limited imaginations aren't great enough to grasp how the creation occurs and who the creator is, but we should be humbled and awed and not try to proselytize about it. At one point, after he talks about, you know, we're like a child in a library who knows the books have been written and the laws have been created, and we try to get the underlying sense of it, a cardinal in Boston accuses him, says, well, it still smacks of atheism because it's not a personal God who will intercede on your behalf and you can pray to. Einstein says, you know, other people look at miracles as evidence of God's existence. I look at the absence of miracles, at the harmonies of the universe as evidence of God's existence. So the cardinal says it still smacks of atheism. So Rabbi Goldstein, Maurice Goldstein, head of the Reform movement in New York at the time, after Einstein has written a beautiful piece called Science and Religion for the New York Times, they're still kind of confused. They send him a telegram. Says, Einstein, answer, do you or do you not believe in God? 50 words or less, answer paid. It's a great telegram. And Einstein doesn't use up the 50 words, but he says, I believe in Spinoza's God, a God who is manifest in the harmonies of the universe. That's the way he leaves it. Now, as you know, Spinoza gets excommunicated, or whatever Jews in Amsterdam did back then to people who were not great. He actually gets denounced by the Catholic Church as well. So he's not, but you know, the concept of God Einstein talks about, it may be confusing to a cardinal and to a rabbi, but I think most of us can kind of feel what he's talking about, because I'm sure any of us who've wrestled with the ultimate questions, you know, have a sense perhaps of a deistic or pantheist, as Spinoza would say, concept of a God whose spirit is manifest in the laws of the universe. Thank you all very much. Let me,